So for my video, I'm going to be talking about flow and the concept and how it applies to being an aide at Restore. So as far as the concept of flow goes for pertaining to aides, flow is an idea or a word rather, that's said a lot. If you're in training at Restore, you'll hear it a bunch. And it's a little bit of an abstract word. It doesn't necessarily make sense right away unless you kind of have the context behind it. But as in general, flow kind of just means how everything's flowing in the office and in the gym. And the way I understand it, there's kind of two different ideas of flow. The first one is kind of for the gym and the office overall. And that's just how kind of different each patient is flowing throughout the gym, kind of making sure that no two patients are kind of waiting to use the same piece of machinery, trying to make sure that like everything's set up so that a patient doesn't have to go over and kind of wait at a piece of equipment for it to be set up by the PT or by the aide. And also to make sure that there's never a time where a patient is not able to do anything because all of the other pieces of equipment are either not set up or being occupied by another patient. And more specifically for each patient, the concept of flow is just how that particular patient is moving through their own appointment, which is a very important thing. Kind of gets into the patient experience, which you may have heard about, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But the most important part about flow and why it's important to aides is kind of the most vital job of the aide. Aides are responsible for doing a lot of different duties around the office, but kind of the bread and butter of what you'll be doing is working on flow. So anytime there's more than two or three patients within the office, that's really when you're gonna have to start paying attention, when you're gonna start making decisions and kind of working on flow. And I kind of touched on it before, but it's important because how a patient goes throughout an appointment is kind of the important part of the patient experience. If they're just kind of standing around at any points, if they feel like they're just being stagnant and they're not really doing anything, they might perceive that time spent as time wasted. It's kind of easy for them when they're receiving manual therapy or if they're in the middle of an exercise, it's easy for them to see that as being productive. They may not like coming to physical therapy, but the only thing worse than coming to therapy, if they really do feel that it is a difficult thing for them, is if they're just waiting around. So we really try to eliminate that. We try to prevent that from happening. And overall, flow is very important because it just improves the overall office efficiency. If you're able to stay on top of things, stay proactive, and kind of either be doing stuff in the background like setting up the steps or raising the the handles on the pulley system to make sure that they're ready for the lat pull downs, which one patient's going to be doing in a little bit. It kind of takes a little bit of the weight off of the physical therapist, who may have one, two, sometimes as many as three patients in at the same time. And it helps everything run a little bit more smoothly. So I touched on it before, but flow is one of the most important things that an aide is going to do in the office, along with the other responsibilities they have. Where flow comes really in handy, or when it's most important, is when the office starts to get filled. So there might be times where there's only one or two patients in the office. In that case, it may not be that difficult to kind of maintain the flow of the office because the physical therapists are going to have a lot of oversight on the patients. And the physical therapists, all the ones you're going to be working with, they're all very good at it. They all understand it. They've probably worked with several aides before. They've worked at Restore for a while, so they have a generally good grasp on how to keep things flowing. So then your job of keeping the flow isn't as important, but you'll find that, for each individual therapist, there might be a time where they have more than one patient, whether that because it was scheduled that way, or whether because there's overlap from one patient, if one patient's running over their scheduled time, you need to start the other patient on time. You can't just keep pushing the schedule back and back and back until every patient is allowed to have one-on-one time. So more likely than not, throughout the day, there are going to be a lot of times that a patient's going to have two patients. The therapist is going to have two patients, and that's kind of where you come in as far as an aide to kind of keep the flow. So a lot of this, in keeping the flow, it requires communication with the therapist and kind of not always a verbal communication, but some kind of even understanding between the therapist and the aide that, if there is going to be overlap, try and, if the therapist is busy doing manual stuff with one patient, the other patient hopefully has a few other exercises that you can run them through that they don't necessarily need specific oversight by the physical therapist. It's probably an exercise they've done multiple times. This could be things they do on the table, such as straight leg raises, clams, hip adductions, just very basic exercises that the patient either knows how to do or you're more than capable of guiding them through. These exercises could also include things like the total gym, lat pull downs, the rows, any number of exercises Unless the therapist has let you know, or unless you're able to notice that the therapist does this, unless there's required oversight by the therapist, you'll be able to kind of take the patient through there. Now, I've just kind of spoken the past few minutes about one patient, but what's likely going to happen at some point, or at most points, I guess, throughout the day, is that there's going to be a lot of patients in that case, in that kind of situation. So you're going to have to be able to kind of look around the office and not get focused too much on one patient. And probably the easiest way to do that is just to kind of go to a patient that you see is not with the therapist, and maybe it's just kind of sitting around, whether they're on the table or whether they're just sitting on a stool near the row machine. You know, if you can tell that they're not doing something, or if you kind of get good enough at it later down the road and you start to realize that they're kind of nearing the end of the one exercise the physical therapist just set them up with, you can look at the chart for that specific patient, and either, you know, if the therapist is going through and filling out all the exercises they've already done, you can look at the exercises they have left, and you could either A, set up those exercises and kind of just tell them, okay, you can go over there and do those, I set them up for you. Or you can B, kind of set it up, and if they're not familiar with it, you can go over, you can be like, okay, we're going to be doing the step ups, you know, this is the one you've done before. So varying level of, I guess, effort you really need to put in for each patient, just depends on each patient. But once you get that patient going, what's in your best interest is kind of look around the office and just see if there's another patient in that same boat. This is something you'll probably be able to keep an eye on, just because you'll have an idea of what patients came in at what point in their specific appointment they are at. So, you know, if they have a lot of manual therapy in the beginning, if you notice that they're done with the manual therapy, you'll have an idea of like, okay, this person's going to be doing a lot of exercises. I can set them up. You know, some patients are even good enough that they're able to set things up, but never count on that. I think I don't think it looks professional to kind of just tell a patient, oh, just go over and do that. I think it's best for you to go over and set it up, just because it's, you know, it's about professionalism. A lot of it's about how the, you know, office looks. And if you're taking an active role in that and you're setting it up, it just looks a lot better on the part of the aides. I mentioned the idea of the patient experience before, and along with flow, the patient experience is probably something that maybe is not always on your mind, but it's always in the back of your head. And just in terms of how you can best affect the patient experience. You know, the patient experience is kind of really important to restore. It's very important in terms of, you know, creating raving fans. So it's something that you need to be conscious of. It's not something that you should just be constantly stressing about and getting, you know, potentially worked up about, but it's something that you definitely need to kind of give proper thought. And, you know, like I mentioned before, the number one way, or one of the number one ways you can kind of improve the patient experience is if you're keeping the patient moving through their appointment and there's no time where they're just kind of sitting there not doing anything. But there's a little bit more than that. You know, that's what's asked of you. And, you know, in terms of doing your job when it comes to flow, if you're kind of keeping everything flowing, if people are kind of occupied doing their own exercises, or, you know, with the therapist, if there's never a time that the office is stagnant, then yeah, sure, you're doing your job. But there's a little bit more to it, and that kind of gets a little bit more into the patient experience. And, you know, it's in your best interest to kind of try and go above and beyond what's called of you. And that you may have an idea of how that sounds. It's not like, you know, you're not going to be asked to work a lot of overtime. You know, you're not going to have to do anything extreme. But what that means is just kind of going out of your way to kind of improve the patient experience. And for me, my understanding of it is the best way you can do that is just to engage the patients, right? So, you know, there's kind of a little bit of a balance there, because you want to engage the patients, you want to talk to them, you want to ask them how it's going, you know, you want to be friendly and amicable, but at the same time, you don't want to hold up the appointment. You know, you might find that there are some patients who really like to talk, and, you know, because they like to talk, they'll stop doing their exercise just so they can talk, because they're animated talkers or for whatever reason. So again, it just comes down to how you deal with things and kind of focusing on keeping that flow going. So if you notice that someone's a really big talker, you may not want to talk as much, or you may want to talk and just kind of remind them to keep doing their exercises. But that's a really good way to kind of keep the patient happy and kind of improve the overall patient experience. And there also might be times where, you know, despite your best efforts, you know, the gym's kind of flowing as best as it can. You know, you're juggling a lot of things at once. You know, there are a bunch of patients running through different exercises, not with their PT, but with things you set them up with. But one way or another, you may come into a time where a patient's just going to have to be sitting there waiting, whether it's because it's towards the end of their appointment and they have to do one last thing, they have to do something on the cable machine. There might be another patient at or near the cable machine. I know right now, in June of 2020, we're going through the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's kind of affecting how people are running through exercises. If one person is on the cable machine, a patient may not even need to use the cable machine. They may need to use the total gym, but in keeping the social distancing idea prevalent in the office, you may not want to take a patient over to do leg presses at the total gym. So there might be instances where the patient is just kind of sitting there. Obviously, we don't like that. To the best of your ability, you really want to try and, again, be proactive, stay ahead of the ball, and kind of prevent that, just so that it's never a problem that becomes a PT problem where they have to kind of stop dealing with one of their patients to kind of look at the patient who's now standing still and not doing anything. But there may be a time when there's really nothing you can do. Maybe it's the end of their appointment, and they just need one last stretch, or they need something more manual from the PT. So what you'll have to do is to try and make them feel like they're not wasting their time, even though that very well might be how they're feeling. And that sounds a lot more complicated, but it kind of gets back to the idea of just engaging the patient, right? So if they're just kind of sitting waiting for the PT to come over, that would not be a great experience. I mean, just imagine if you're in their shoes. Your appointment is nearing its end. You have things to do. You don't want to just be sitting there, right? I'm sure everybody's had the experience in a doctor's office where you're just kind of sitting there. It feels like they're wasting your time. You don't appreciate that. But one way to kind of fill that time to make them feel like it's not wasted is just by talking to them, and it's just coming up with any type of conversation. You're a person, you probably know what you like to talk about. So I'm assuming you're pretty okay at coming up with things to talk about with the patient. It shouldn't be that hard. And by just talking to the patient, it makes them feel as though their time isn't wasted, because a lot of them might be looking to have conversation. The fact of the matter is some people come in, like I said before, right now with the COVID-19 thing going on, there's a lot of patients who they don't really get out of the house that much. This is their one time to get out of the house. And I know in the future, that's obviously going to be a little bit different. There aren't going to be the restrictive quarantine guidelines. But even still, people, this might be one of the only errands they're running for that day. And this may be one of the only times where they're really going to have the opportunity to have a lot of social interaction. So just by talking to them, there's a very good chance they're looking to have a conversation. They're looking to talk about anything. And every single patient I've run into, they're very friendly people. They always have something to talk about. It's just a matter of finding what's there to talk about. And just by engaging them and talking to them, it'll sometimes buy the PTs enough time to kind of finish up what they're doing, and then come over to the patient you're talking to, and then you guys can do kind of a switcheroo, and you can kind of help that patient that the PT was just with run them through the rest of their exercises to kind of keep the overall flow going. And just in terms of kind of going above and beyond the call of duty, I think to kind of sum it up in one point is just to be friendly. Go out of your way to be friendly. Try and make conversation. And again, to an extent, you don't want to be too friendly to the point where you're actively hurting the flow of the office, right? But just kind of trying it, and this is something you're probably going to learn. You're going to have to figure out by yourself. This is something that would probably be worthwhile talking to the PTs, because the PTs have a very good understanding on each patient. If the PTs know that patient is a little bit of a talker, they'll either tell you a lot of times, and they'll be like, hey, listen, you can talk to them, but just kind of make sure they're still doing their exercise, just because it is important that it's not that you're wasting time by talking to them, but just kind of making sure everything's moving efficiently. That's all I have to say about flow. I know we talked about a bunch of things today. I kind of probably threw a lot at you, but if there's one takeaway I want you to have, other than obviously the concept of flow and kind of how to go above and beyond the call of duty to kind of keep the flow going and keep the patients happy, it would be not to get discouraged. Rather, I know when I first started as an aide here, I had no experience being an aide, and despite being trained for like almost 3 months, I don't think anything really prepared me for getting or becoming an aide by yourself and kind of working by yourself and dealing with the gym. And mind you, before all the COVID-19 breakout stuff happened, we had at one point around 5 PTs, and each PT could have anywhere from like 1 to 2, sometimes even 3 patients in at the same time, especially at the busier hours, like before or after work for a lot of people. So the gym gets really busy, and it can be a little overwhelming. It will be overwhelming, if you're not used to it, that kind of volume. And it might be a little discouraging if you find that you're not able to keep the flow going perfectly right away. But one of the main takeaways I want you to have from this video is that, again, not to get discouraged, to understand that it might take you a while to learn the flow. It did with me as well. And also to feel free to reach out to the PTs, kind of, if you're having trouble keeping the patients flowing, talk to them and just see, how they think you should be doing something, or, maybe there's some way that you can communicate prior to the patients coming in to try and figure out, like, okay, you're going to have 2 people coming in, you're going to have more people in at that time that you do have tables available. So maybe if you do manual stuff with this patient, finish that up, and then they won't need the table for the rest of the appointment. You clean off the table, bring the new patient onto the table, keep that other patient running through the exercise. I can give you any number of examples. It's not that important right now. But communication is key, obviously, and don't get discouraged. It's an easy job. Towards the end of the day, it's not always easy, but it's a very easy concept, and it's very important to restore. So I think it's really important that you know what flow is, how to kind of keep the patients going, keep them running through their appointments, and most of all, keep them happy.